In the grim tapestry of World War II atrocities, few threads are as dark as that of the Dirlewanger Brigade. This notorious SS unit, officially known as the SS-Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, would become synonymous with unmatched savagery, even by Nazi standards. Its formation and early operations represent a unique case study in how the Third Reich deliberately channeled criminality into organized terror. As one SS investigator would later note in an internal report, Dirlewanger's men are not soldiers but a band of criminals. The unit's genesis cannot be understood without examining its namesake and commander, Oskar Dirlewanger, a man whose personal depravity would become institutionalized in the brigade he led. Born in 1895 in Würzburg, Germany, Dirlewanger initially appeared to be on a conventional path. He volunteered for military service in World War I, where he was wounded 6 times and decorated for bravery, earning the Iron Cross, 1st and 2nd class. His service with the 123rd Grenadier Regiment on the Western Front earned him a reputation for ruthlessness and effectiveness. After the war, he obtained a doctorate in political science from the University of Frankfurt, an achievement that belied the brutality that would define his later years. His dissertation, ironically, focused on the German labor service system. The interwar period revealed Dirlewanger's true character. He joined the Nazi Party early in 1922 and participated in the failed beer hall putsch of 1923 alongside Hitler. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, he developed a reputation for excessive drinking and violence, frequently being involved in street brawls in Stuttgart, where he led a section of the SA Sturmabteilung. His academic credentials allowed him to secure a position as a welfare officer, but his career was derailed in 1934 when he was convicted of taking advantage of a young woman from the League of German Girls. This was not an isolated incident. Multiple reports indicate a history of taking advantage of young women. During his trial in Stuttgart, additional charges emerged suggesting he had exploited at least 6 other young women. Sentenced to 2 years in prison, Dirlewanger was expelled from both the Nazi Party and the SA. For most, this would have meant permanent disgrace in the Third Reich, which publicly espoused moral purity. Yet Dirlewanger found a path back to power through his former comrade Gottlob Berger, who had risen to become a senior figure in the SS. Berger's patronage proved crucial, as he persuaded Heinrich Himmler that Dirlewanger's military experience could be valuable. In a memorandum to Himmler dated 1940, Berger described Dirlewanger as an original German man whose minor human weaknesses should be overlooked in service to the Reich. Seeking rehabilitation, Dirlewanger volunteered for the Spanish Civil War in 1936, fighting with the Condor Legion in support of Franco's nationalists. Here, his appetite for brutality flourished in a conflict notable for its ruthlessness. During the Battle of Teruel in 1938, Dirlewanger reportedly participated in mass executions of Republican prisoners, methods he would later employ on a larger scale in Eastern Europe. He returned to Germany in 1939 with renewed military credentials and the protection of influential patrons, receiving the Spanish Cross in silver and partial restoration of his party status. The outbreak of World War II created the perfect opportunity for Dirlewanger's rehabilitation. As the conflict expanded, the German military faced increasing manpower shortages. In this context, Berger proposed a radical solution to Himmler: create special units composed of convicted poachers. The reasoning was that poachers possessed skills useful for anti-partisan warfare, tracking, marksmanship, and knowledge of forest terrain. Himmler approved the concept, and in June 1940, the Wilddiebkommando Oranienburg, Poachers Command Oranienburg, was established under Dirlewanger's leadership. Himmler saw this as an experiment in military rehabilitation, a concept he described in a letter to Berger as turning a social elements into useful members of the Germanic community. This initial formation, consisting of approximately 80 convicted poachers released from concentration camps and prisons, represented a significant departure from SS norms. While the SS had positioned itself as an elite, racially pure organization with strict recruitment standards, Dirlewanger's unit explicitly recruited criminals. The decision reflected not just manpower desperation, but also a calculated strategy. These men, dependent on Nazi leadership for their freedom, could be expected to show absolute loyalty and ruthlessness toward enemies of the Reich. Among the first recruits was Rudolf Stettler, a notorious Bavarian poacher who had spent 8 years in prison for shooting a gamekeeper and who had become one of Dirlewanger's most trusted subordinates. By 1941, as Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, created vast occupied territories requiring control, the unit expanded its recruitment criteria. No longer limited to poachers, it began to accept convicted criminals of various types, robbers, murderers, and those with a history of depraved acts. This expansion reflected both growing manpower needs and the unit's evolving mission toward terror operations. Kurt Weisser, a former Dachau guard and convicted murderer, joined as a company commander, bringing with him concentration camp experience that would inform the unit's methods of brutality. Dirlewanger's personnel file from this period, preserved in the Berlin Document Center, notes his promotion to SS Obersturmführer, first lieutenant, with the comment, particularly suited for special operations. Unlike regular SS formations, Dirlewanger's men received minimal formal training. Their preparation at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1940 focused more on building loyalty to Dirlewanger than on conventional military skills. Discipline was maintained not through standard military protocols, but through Dirlewanger's personal brutality. He regularly beat his men, executed those who displeased him, and cultivated an atmosphere of terror within the unit itself. In one documented case, Dirlewanger shot a soldier named Franz Schipper for refusing to participate in the execution of young men. This internal culture of violence inevitably shaped how the brigade would operate in the field. A former unit member testifying at post-war trials stated, "The only rule was that there were no rules." These actions drew protests from Wehrmacht officers operating in the region. General Max von Schenkendorf, commanding the rear area of Army Group Center, wrote to the High Command complaining that Dirlewanger's methods were counterproductive, creating more partisans than they eliminated. In a memo dated October 1942, he described the unit as a bunch of criminal elements and a disgrace to our army. Local German administrators similarly objected that the indiscriminate murder of the workforce undermined economic exploitation of the region. Hermann Schildknecht, the civilian administrator of the Borissow district, filed a formal complaint stating that Dirlewanger's actions had rendered entire agricultural areas useless due to depopulation. These complaints reached Himmler but were dismissed. Instead, Dirlewanger received commendations for successful anti-partisan operations and was promoted to SS Sturmbannführer, Major. Himmler personally visited the unit in 1943 and reportedly told Dirlewanger, "The Führer and I watch your progress with particular interest." By late 1942, the unit had grown to battalion strength and continued expanding. Their early success in Belarus, measured in body counts rather than security improvements, led to their deployment in other occupied territories with significant partisan activity, including parts of Ukraine and later Poland. What made the Dirlewanger Brigade unique, even among Nazi formations, was not merely the criminality of its members, but the institutional encouragement of their worst impulses. While other German units committed atrocities under orders, Dirlewanger's men were selected specifically for their predisposition to violence and given implicit permission to indulge their sadistic tendencies. As historian Christian Ingrau noted in his study of the unit, the Dirlewanger Brigade was not an aberration of the Nazi system, but its logical conclusion, the perfect fusion of ideology and instinct unconstrained by even minimal moral boundaries. Monsters in uniform, witnessing the atrocities of the Dirlewanger Brigade. The dense forests of Belarus whispered with terror in the summer of 1942. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoldering ruins within hours, their inhabitants subjected to atrocities so extreme that even hardened Wehrmacht officers recoiled in horror. Under the euphemistic title Operation Bandenbekämpfung, Bandit Fighting, the Dirlewanger Brigade conducted what amounted to a systematic extermination campaign across the Belarusian countryside. This was no conventional anti-partisan operation. Records from the German military archives reveal that the brigade's reports often claimed thousands of bandits eliminated while capturing only a handful of weapons. clear evidence that the vast majority of victims were unarmed civilians. During a single operation in August 1942 in the Pripyat Marshes region, Dirlewanger reported 6,657 people killed, but only 259 rifles captured. In the village of Borki alone, 1,741 villagers were massacred in November 1942, including 950 young souls. The unit's operational diary, captured after the war, contained the chilling entry, "Mission accomplished, village no longer exists." The brigade's methodology in Belarus followed a terrifying pattern. Upon entering a village suspected of harboring partisans, Dirlewanger's men would surround it, preventing escape. All inhabitants would be gathered in the central square for selection. Those deemed capable of labor would be shipped to Germany as slave workers. The elderly, the infirm and young souls were often herded into the largest wooden structure in the village, typically a barn or church, which would then be set ablaze. August von Kageneck, a Wehrmacht officer who witnessed one such incident near Minsk, later wrote in his memoirs, "The screams from inside that burning building will haunt me until my dying day," and the Dirlewanger men were laughing. In the village of Dori in July 1942, 284 people were locked in a church and burned alive. The only survivor, Varvara Kononova, escaped by hiding beneath corpses and later testified, "They herded everyone inside, blocked the doors with benches, poured gasoline, and threw in grenades. I survived only because the dead fell on top of me." The brigade's methods grew increasingly sadistic as their campaign progressed. Survivors and German military witnesses reported that unit members developed games involving their victims. One such game, documented in post-war trials, involved forcing defenseless women to retrieve items from cold water in winter, then using them for target practice when they emerged. Another involved injecting women with strychnine to observe their death throes, which Dirlewanger allegedly referred to as scientific research. SS Rottenführer Josef Blöcher, who later served with the brigade, testified after the war, "Even among those of us who had become accustomed to killing, the Dirlewanger method stood out as exceptionally cruel." In the town of Svisloch, the unit reportedly forced defenseless women to dance around a bonfire made from their clothing before facing unimaginable degradation and being shot. SS man Hubert Lallier, who deserted the unit in 1943 and escaped to Sweden, provided testimony that Dirlewanger personally participated in these entertainments, often selecting victims himself and encouraging competition among his officers for the most creative forms of torture. Perhaps most disturbing were the brigade's actions toward young souls. Multiple witness accounts describe Dirlewanger's men impaling innocents on bayonets or throwing them into burning buildings. In the village of Pekalin, according to surviving documentation from the Soviet Extraordinary Commission on Nazi Crimes, soldiers competed to see how many young souls they could kill with a single bullet by lining them up one behind another. A German military police report from October 1942 noted, "The conduct of SS-Sonderkommando D with regard to the Belarusian civilian population, especially young ones, represents a level of barbarism unprecedented even in this theater." In the hamlet of Kozly, near Byalozersk, according to survivor Anna Lysenko, Dirlewanger's men gathered 26 young souls in a schoolhouse, forced them to stand in line, and shot them one by one while making the others watch. The last innocent, Mikhail Petrov, was spared only to be used as a human target for bayonet practice. Hermann Fegelein, an SS liaison officer who later became Hitler's brother-in-law, reportedly complained to Himmler, "Dirlewanger's men shoot young souls for sport. This is not combat, it's lunacy." By 1944, as the Eastern Front collapsed, the Dirlewanger Brigade, now expanded to regimental size, found itself redirected to a new theater of operations, Warsaw. When the Polish Home Army launched its uprising on August 1, 1944, the Nazi leadership deployed Dirlewanger's men as part of the suppression force, a decision that would lead to one of the war's most concentrated episodes of mass murder. Dirlewanger arrived in Warsaw with approximately 865 men, a number that would swell to nearly 2,000 as reinforcements were funneled to his command. SS Gruppenführer Heinz Reinefahrt, tasked with overall command of the suppression forces in the Wola district, reportedly remarked upon their arrival. "These are not men, but wild beasts pumped up with vodka." The brigade arrived in Warsaw on August 4, 1944, and was immediately assigned to the Western District of Wola with explicit orders from Himmler. Any inhabitant of Warsaw you encounter is to be killed, regardless of whether they are men, women, or young souls. What followed was methodical slaughter. Over 5 days, Dirlewanger's troops went building by building through Wola, killing every person they found. They transformed the Wola hospital into a charnel house, executing patients in their beds and burning the building with the wounded still inside. At the St. Lazarus Hospital, witnesses reported that Dirlewanger personally supervised the execution of medical staff and patients, pausing the killings only to choose young women for degrading treatment before their execution. Dr. Zbigniew Kuzisin, one of the few staff members to survive, later testified, "They burst into the surgical ward while I was operating. They shot my patient on the table, then lined us against the wall. I survived only because an artillery shell hit nearby, creating enough confusion for me to escape through a window." The Wola massacre reached its horrific peak on August 5th, when an estimated 40,000 civilians were killed in just 3 days, a rate of mass murder that exceeded even that of the Nazi death camps at their most efficient. The St. Adalbert's Church became a killing site, where hundreds were machine-gunned inside the nave. The Ursus factory was transformed into an execution ground, where victims were lined up against walls and shot in groups. At the Franaszek factory on Wolska Street, over 4,000 people were executed on August 5th alone. The scope and intensity of the killing prompted SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who had been appointed to command the suppression of the uprising, to modify the orders on August 9th, directing that women and young men should be expelled from the city rather than killed outright, not from compassion, but because the mass executions were diverting too many personnel from fighting the actual insurgents. In his post-war testimony at Nuremberg, Bach-Zelewski stated, "I had to change Himmler's order because Dirlewanger's men were so busy murdering civilians, they forgot we had an armed uprising to suppress." Survivor testimonies from Warsaw paint a picture of unrestrained sadism. Wanda Lurie, pregnant at the time, survived the mass execution of several thousand civilians at the Ursus factory on August 5th, despite being shot multiple times. She later testified, "They shot us with machine guns. I received 4 bullet wounds in my back. The bullets penetrated my right arm and both my hips. I fell but remained conscious, covered with the bodies of other victims." Lurie witnessed the murder of her 3 young men before being shot herself. She survived by lying motionless among corpses until nightfall, then crawling away. Miraculously, she gave birth to a healthy son in a German transit camp weeks later. Janina Rosinska, another survivor from the Ochota district, described how Dirlewanger's men turned the student dormitory Zieleniak into a torture center. They would select women daily for their entertainment in the guardhouse. None returned alive. We could hear their screams all night. Polish underground courier Wanda Felicia Chelmika documented in her diary that Dirlewanger himself established a harem in a commandeered apartment on Poznańska Street, where young women were brought for the officers' use. Despite their savagery, the Dirlewanger Brigade proved tactically incompetent against armed opponents. When confronting barricades manned by Polish Home Army fighters, they suffered catastrophic casualties due to poor training and reckless assault tactics. During the first 10 days of fighting, the brigade lost approximately 40% of its strength. Casualties they made up for by press-ganging Hungarian Jews and former Soviet POWs into their ranks. SS Gruppenführer Heinz Reinefarth, commanding alongside Dirlewanger, reportedly radioed to higher command, "What should I do with these men? They're more dangerous to us than to the enemy." At the barricade on Okapawa Street, a single Home Army unit armed with just 1 machine gun and Molotov cocktails repelled 3 consecutive assaults by Dirlewanger's troops, inflicting over 70 casualties. The brigade's performance was so poor that General Nikolaus von Forman, commanding the 9th Army, noted in his war diary, "The Dirlewanger unit is a collection of criminals who can murder defenseless women but collapse when facing actual resistance. What made the Dirlewanger Brigade extraordinary, even in the context of Nazi war crimes, was how their actions appalled even other SS formations. SS Judge Georg Konrad Morgan, who investigated corruption and crimes within the SS, attempted to bring charges against Dirlewanger for theft and violence, but was blocked by Himmler's office. An internal SS investigation from 1943 described the brigade as in danger of losing its soldierly value due to its composition of asocial elements, yet it continued to receive commendations rather than censure. SS Sturmbannführer Johannes Hassebroek, commandant of Gross Rosen concentration camp, after witnessing the brigade in action, reportedly remarked, "And they call us criminals?" Even Arthur Greiser, the notoriously brutal Gauleiter of the Wartheland region, complained to Heinrich Himmler about the unit's behavior when they were briefly stationed near Poznan in 1943, writing, "Their conduct undermines German authority and disgraces the uniform they wear." The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors created wounds that would never fully heal. Maria Piskorska, a nurse who survived the massacre at the Holy Trinity Hospital in Warsaw, reported suffering nightmares for decades afterward. "I still hear the screams of my patients as they were dragged from their beds. Some of them clung to me, begging for help I couldn't provide." In Belarus, entire communities were erased so completely that post-war Soviet authorities sometimes had difficulty determining where villages had once stood. The town of Katyn became a symbol for hundreds of destroyed villages. Its memorial featuring the only adult male survivor, blacksmith Josef Kaminski, who returned after the massacre to find his burned son still alive, only to have the boy die in his arms. Kaminski's testimony formed the basis for Ales Adamovich's documentary novel, Katyn, in which he writes, "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is a duty of the living to do so for them." Operation Annihilation, the Dirlewanger Brigade in Belarus and Warsaw. The morning after a successful anti-partisan operation in the Belarusian village of Dori in July 1942, SS Obersturmführer Oskar Dirlewanger discovered one of his company commanders, SS Untersturmführer Erich Ehrenberger, unconscious, surrounded by empty schnapps bottles and a female prisoner who had been beaten to death during the night. Rather than disciplining the officer, Dirlewanger simply ordered the body disposed of and had the commander revived with cold water to continue the day's operations. This incident, recorded in the memoirs of a Wehrmacht liaison officer attached to the unit, Major Karl Günther von Hase, encapsulates the internal reality of what was perhaps the most dysfunctional military formation in modern history. The Dirlewanger Brigade represented a radical experiment in military organization, one where traditional military discipline was replaced by a culture of brutality, excessive drinking, and barely controlled chaos. At any given moment during operations, a significant portion of the unit was intoxicated. Alcohol requisitioning became so excessive that in February 1943, SS Economic Administration Office records show a complaint from SS Sturmbannführer Otto Vogel that Dirlewanger's unit had consumed a 3-month supply of schnapps in just 2 weeks. The brigade maintained what they called field pharmacies, collections of stimulants, primarily Pervitin, which soldiers used freely before operations. A medical officer seconded to the unit from the Wehrmacht, Dr. Klaus Petersmann, reported that during the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising, approximately 80% of the brigade's men were under the influence of either alcohol or stimulants while conducting operations. His diary entry from August 7, 1944 notes, "Conducted amputation on Rottenführer Schulz, who shot off his own foot while intoxicated." Third such incident this week. These men fight not with courage, but with chemical courage. The unit's reputation for excessive drinking became so notorious that the local German military administration in Belarus began hiding alcohol supplies whenever they received word that Dirlewanger's men were approaching their area. This habitual overconsumption of alcohol fueled an atmosphere of unpredictable violence within the unit itself. Former member Hubert Lallier, who deserted in 1943 and escaped to Sweden, testified after the war that fights between brigade members frequently turned deadly. At least once a week, someone would be killed in a drunken brawl, he claimed. The officers were the worst. They'd shoot subordinates for the slightest perceived insult. One particularly notorious incident, occurred in November 1942 near Minsk, when company commander Kurt Weisser shot 3 of his own men who had fallen asleep on sentry duty, then ordered their bodies displayed as a warning. Dirlewanger not only approved such actions, but encouraged them as a means of maintaining control through terror. During their deployment to Slovakia to suppress the 1944 uprising, SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Freytag executed 5 of his own men for attempting to desert with stolen valuables. Rather than viewing this as a disciplinary problem, Dirlewanger reportedly promoted Freytag, telling him, "You understand how to handle these animals." According to SS personnel records captured after the war, the brigade lost almost as many men to internal violence and executions, 182 documented cases, as they did to partisan attacks during their time in Belarus. Female personnel assigned to or captured by the brigade faced systematic violence. In Belarus, the unit maintained what they euphemistically called comfort stations, essentially forced labor camps where local women were held for the brigade's use. In the village of Lovici, they converted the town hall into such a facility, holding approximately 40 women. According to testimony from survivor Nadezhda Kurilovich, most captives died within weeks due to harsh conditions and neglect. More shocking was the treatment of their own female auxiliaries. German women serving as nurses and communications specialists with the unit reported such severe misconduct and improper treatment that the SAS main office eventually had to issue a special directive in June 1943 forbidding the improper treatment of female SS auxiliaries. This directive was largely ignored. A German Red Cross nurse, Margarete Fiedler, who was briefly assigned to the brigade in 1943, later wrote in her diary, "These are not men, but animals. I fear for my life every night and have barricaded my door, but still they try to break in. No one will help." After her reassignment due to injuries sustained during a violent encounter, she reported her experiences to SS Oberfuhrer Waldemar Fegelein, who allegedly responded, "Be thankful you escaped with your life. We do not send our best men to Dirlewanger." In Warsaw, during the 1944 uprising, the brigade commandeered a school building on Storki Street as their headquarters, where female prisoners were brought for the officers' entertainment. Polish underground courier Elżbieta Ostrowska, who escaped from this makeshift comfort station, testified that women who resisted were tortured with lit cigarettes before facing unspeakable cruelty and death. At the apex of this dysfunctional system stood Dirlewanger himself, who ruled through a combination of personal brutality and permissiveness toward those loyal to him. He personally executed members of his unit who showed reluctance to participate in atrocities. During one operation in the Białowieża forest in early 1943, he shot a young soldier, 19-year-old SS Schütze Wilhelm Kaul, who refused to participate in burning a village. According to witnesses, Dirlewanger declared to the assembled unit, "This is what happens to those too weak for our work." Paradoxically, he permitted almost any excess among those who demonstrated sufficient cruelty toward the enemy, creating a perverse incentive system that rewarded the most sadistic elements within the already criminal brigade. His personal orderly, SS Unterscharführer Josef Sepp Leitgeber, was known for carrying out Dirlewanger's executions and was permitted to select women from captured villages for his personal use. Leitgeber later died during the Warsaw Uprising when, according to multiple accounts, he was too drunk to recognize a Polish resistance position and walked directly into machine gun fire. Dirlewanger's own alcohol consumption was legendary. SS Oberfuhrer Nickel, after inspecting the unit in October 1942, reported, "Dirlewanger appears to be perpetually intoxicated, yet maintains an iron grip on his men through unpredictable outbursts of violence." The relationship between Dirlewanger's unit and the broader German military structure was characterized by tension and disgust. Wehrmacht officers repeatedly filed complaints about the brigade's conduct. General Max von Schenkendorf, commanding the rear area of Army Group Center, sent a scathing report to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge in December 1942, describing the brigade as a collection of criminals and deviants who disgrace the German uniform. Colonel Helmuth Grosskirth, a staff officer with Army Group Center, wrote in his diary, "The excesses of the Dirlewanger unit are so revolting that they're discussed even in frontline positions. Every decent German soldier feels only shame about such comrades. In February 1943, after the brigade had requisitioned fuel and ammunition from Wehrmacht supplies without authorization, Major General Rudolf von Gersdorf attempted to have military police arrest Dirlewanger, only to be overruled by SS authorities. General Hans Krebs, later Chief of Staff of the Army, encountered the brigade near Mogilev in 1943 and wrote to his wife, "I have seen today what hell looks like. It wears German uniforms and calls itself a special commando." Perhaps most telling was the reaction of Lieutenant General Erwin Jolassa, who refused to allow Dirlewanger's men to be billeted near his troops, writing in an official memorandum, "I cannot guarantee the safety of either party should they be housed in proximity, as my men have expressed their intention to execute these criminals at the first opportunity." Even within the SS, which hardly represented a moral high ground, the Dirlewanger Brigade was considered beyond the pale. SS Obergruppenführer Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger, higher SS and police leader in the general government of occupied Poland, attempted to have the unit removed from his jurisdiction after witnessing their behavior during anti-Jewish operations in the Lublin district in early 1942. In an unusual step, he wrote directly to Himmler, "These men are a greater danger to German order than the enemies they supposedly combat." SS Judge Georg Conrad Morgan, famous for prosecuting corruption and criminality within concentration camps, opened an investigation into Dirlewanger in 1943 for theft of Jewish property and immoral offences, only to have the investigation quashed by direct intervention from Himmler's office. After inspecting the unit in 1944, SS Brigadeführer Johannes Schäfer reported, "This is not a military formation, but a mobile asylum for the criminally insane. Their behavior brings dishonor to the Black Corps." During joint operations with the Kaminsky Brigade, another notorious SS unit composed of Russian collaborators, in Warsaw, even these hardened collaborators were reportedly disturbed by Dirlewanger's methods. Mieczysław Szymański, a Polish doctor forced to treat wounded SS men during the uprising, overheard a Kaminsky officer remark, "We kill, but they torture before killing. Even we have limits." Despite these complaints, Dirlewanger enjoyed extraordinary protection from the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. His primary patron, SS Obergruppenführer Gottlob Berger, head of the SS main office, repeatedly intervened on his behalf. When confronted with evidence of the brigade's excesses, Berger reportedly responded, "One cannot fight partisans with Salvation Army methods." In a particularly revealing incident, when presented with evidence that Dirlewanger's men had committed atrocities against the young women of a German civilian administrator in Belarus, Berger allegedly dismissed the complaint with, "War brings casualties on all sides. These young women died for Germany too." Himmler himself visited the unit in early 1943 and, rather than disciplining them for widely reported atrocities, awarded Dirlewanger the German Cross in gold and authorized the expansion of his command. Perhaps most desperate was the incorporation of former enemies into the unit. Beginning in late 1943, Dirlewanger began accepting Hilfswillige, auxiliaries, from among Soviet prisoners of war. These men, facing starvation in POW camps, were offered the choice between certain death and service in the brigade. Unsurprisingly, many chose the latter, but deserted at the first opportunity. During operations in Slovakia in 1944, an entire company of former Soviet soldiers defected to partisan forces in a single night, taking their weapons with them. This led to a standing order that all Eastern volunteers be paired with German personnel and never given night guard duty together. In a particularly troubling development, by 1944, the brigade began incorporating inmates from concentration camps, including some Jewish prisoners from Hungary. SS documents captured after the war revealed that in August 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, approximately 90 Hungarian Jews from Auschwitz were temporarily released to serve as ammunition carriers for the brigade. According to survivor testimony from Avraham Levin, one of these prisoners, they were marched into combat without weapons, forced to carry ammunition forward to German positions while under fire. "None of us expected to survive," Levin recalled. "We were expendable bodies, nothing more." Of the 90 prisoners sent to Warsaw, only 7 survived the uprising, having escaped during the confusion of urban combat. The hunted wolves, the violent dissolution of Dirlewanger's brigade. The snows of Hungary's Buda Hills were stained crimson in February 1945 as the Dirlewanger Brigade made its last stand against the advancing Soviet 6th Guards tank army. Once nearly 4,000 strong, the unit had been reduced to barely 700 men, a shadow of the terror formation that had cut a swath of destruction across Eastern Europe. The brigade's final months mirrored the death throes of the Third Reich itself, chaotic, brutal, and marked by increasing desperation as the forces of retribution closed in from all sides. "In the end, we ran like jackals," recalled SS-Unterscharführer Ernst Rode in a 1962 interview from his home in Argentina. The hunters had become the hunted, and for those who knew what awaited us if captured, surrender was never an option. By mid-1944, as the Eastern Front collapsed under Soviet pressure, the Dirlewanger Brigade found itself in an increasingly precarious position. After their bloody rampage during the Warsaw Uprising, where they had suffered nearly 50% casualties, the unit was hastily reorganized, reinforced with more convicts and foreign conscripts, and deployed to Slovakia to suppress the national uprising there. This campaign, while ultimately successful for the Germans, exposed the brigade's growing vulnerability when faced with determined resistance. In the mountain villages around Banska Bystrica, Dirlewanger's men encountered Slovak partisan units led by experienced officers and suffered significant losses. SS after-action reports from October 1944 noted that the brigade lost 216 men in just 3 weeks of fighting, losses they could no longer easily replace as Germany's manpower reserves dwindled. The unit's notorious brutality continued unabated during this campaign. In the village of Kremnica, they executed 747 civilians, including 211 women and 58 young men, dumping the bodies in anti-tank ditches. Slovak partisan commander Captain Jan Stanislav later remarked, "They fought as they lived, without courage or honor. They were brave only when facing unarmed villagers." The unit's retreat westward through Slovakia and into Hungary became increasingly disorganized. Discipline, never strong to begin with, collapsed entirely in many companies. A Wehrmacht liaison officer, Captain Rudolf Lindemann, reported in December 1944, "The Dirlewanger formation is no longer a cohesive fighting unit, but a collection of armed groups scavenging their way westward." Desertion rates soared, particularly among the non-German members. By November 1944, the brigade had lost nearly half its eastern volunteers to desertion. Many simply disappeared into the countryside, shedding their uniforms and attempting to blend in with civilian populations. Others actively sought to surrender to advancing Soviet forces, though this was typically a fatal choice given the unit's reputation. In the Hungarian town of Kecskemet, a group of 23 former Red Army soldiers who had been pressed into service with the brigade attempted to surrender to Soviet advance units. According to Soviet military archives, all were executed on the spot after their Dirlewanger tattoos, blood group markings under the arm, were discovered. SS Hauptsturmführer Franz Magil noted in his field diary on December 14, 1944, "Discipline completely broken down in 3rd Company. Shot 2 men for attempting to desert last night. The others watched, but showed no reaction. They are already dead inside." As Soviet forces pushed into Hungary in early 1945, the brigade was thrown into hopeless defensive battles around Budapest. In the fighting near Lake Balaton, they were ordered to hold positions against overwhelming Soviet armor without appropriate anti-tank weapons. The results were predictable. Radio communications intercepted by Soviet intelligence and later captured revealed increasingly desperate messages from Dirlewanger to his superiors. Ammunition exhausted, enemy tanks breaking through, request permission to withdraw. Records from the Soviet 6th Guards Tank Army indicate that they identified the Dirlewanger Brigade as a priority target due to their reputation for atrocities, dedicating additional artillery to positions where they were known to be deployed. Soviet Major Ilya Ehrenberg, the famous war correspondent, wrote in his frontline dispatches, "We have identified the butchers of Warsaw. No quarter will be given." Near the town of Székesfehérvár, On February 14, 1945, the brigade's headquarters company was overrun by T-34 tanks of the Second Ukrainian Front. According to Soviet accounts, 122 Dirlewanger men were captured, of whom only 14 survived to reach prisoner-of-war camps. By April 1945, with Germany's defeat inevitable, the brigade had splintered into several disconnected groups attempting to flee westward, preferably into American or British captivity, rather than falling into Soviet hands. The unit's internal cohesion finally shattered completely when rumors spread that Dirlewanger himself had abandoned his men, fleeing toward the Alps with a small personal escort. While not entirely accurate, Dirlewanger had actually been wounded in February and evacuated to a field hospital in Altshausen after being hit by shrapnel near Steckesverheer. The perception of abandonment accelerated the unit's dissolution. A former brigade member, Kurt Raeder, captured by American forces in May 1945, testified, "By the end, it was every man for himself. The only orders were to run." Some groups made it as far as Austria's Tyrol region, where SS Obersturmführer Kurt Weisser and approximately 30 men surrendered to the American 42nd Infantry Division on May 3, 1945. According to the arrest report, they had discarded their SS uniforms and attempted to pass themselves off as Wehrmacht stragglers, but were identified by concentration camp tattoos and distinctive unit insignia found in their packs. Other fragments of the unit headed north toward Czechoslovakia, where they encountered particularly brutal treatment from local resistance forces. Near the town of Pribram, a group of 14 identified Dirlewanger men were captured by Czech partisans and, according to local records, buried alive in a disused mine shaft. The fate of Oskar Dirlewanger himself remains one of the war's murkier epilogues. The official record indicates that after recovering from wounds received in Hungary, he was captured by French forces near the town of Altshausen in southwestern Germany on June 1, 1945. He was reportedly wearing civilian clothes and carrying false identification papers under the name Gregor Berger, a sardonic nod to his patron Gottlob Berger, who had originally founded the unit. French occupation authorities detained him in a former Wehrmacht barracks in the town of Altshausen, where he died on June 7, 1945, allegedly from injuries sustained during his capture. The French military doctor who signed the death certificate, Dr. Marcel Léger, noted simply cardiac arrest following physical trauma as the cause of death. This straightforward account, however, has been questioned by multiple historians and investigators. The most prevalent alternative theory suggests that Dirlewanger was recognized by Polish forced laborers who had been liberated by the French and were working as guards at the detention facility. According to this version, once they identified him, these Polish guards beat Dirlewanger to death in an act of vigilante justice. Former Polish resistance fighter Jan Podolski claimed in a 1981 interview with historian Rolf Michaelis that he participated in the beating. "We knew exactly who he was. What happened to him was nothing compared to what he had done in Warsaw." Supporting this theory, French military police officer Jean-Paul Heriot stated in a 1975 interview, "The official story was that he died from his wounds, but everyone knew the Poles got to him. There was no investigation because, frankly, no one cared if the degenerates suffered." Adding further credence, when Dirlewanger's body was exhumed in 1960 as part of a German war crimes investigation, the autopsy revealed evidence of extensive beating rather than combat wounds. Further complicating the narrative, several post-war sightings of Dirlewanger were reported, primarily in Middle Eastern and South American countries. A Mossad investigation in the 1950s pursued claims that he was living in Egypt under the protection of former Nazi officers advising the Egyptian military. Former SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny, who ran an informal network helping Nazi fugitives, reportedly told associates that Dirlewanger had escaped to Egypt via the Syrian rat line. Similarly, Argentine immigration records revealed that someone using one of Dirlewanger's known aliases, Josef Wagner, entered the country in 1948 and settled in the Bariloche region, a notorious haven for Nazi fugitives. While most historians dismiss these accounts as cases of mistaken identity or deliberate misinformation, they contributed to a mythology that many of the war's worst criminals escaped justice. Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter, concluded after investigating these claims. Dirlewanger died in 1945. The ghost sightings reflect more our fear that such monsters could escape justice than any reality. A significant number of middle and lower-ranking members successfully reintegrated into post-war German society, particularly in West Germany, where Cold War priorities often superseded denazification efforts. Former brigade member Heinz Barth lived openly in East Germany under his own name until 1981, working as a businessman in Strausberg near Berlin, when he was finally identified, tried, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Released in 1997 due to ill health, he lived another decade without showing remorse, once telling an interviewer, "We were just following orders." More disturbing was the case of Kurt Peter Leiding, who had participated in massacres in Belarus, but became a respected police officer in Frankfurt during the 1950s. Only in 1964, when a survivor recognized him during a routine traffic stop, was his past exposed. Despite evidence of his involvement in at least 3 village massacres, he received only a 4-year sentence due to legal ambiguities in applying German law to crimes committed abroad. Upon his release, he told Der Spiegel, "The past is the past. Germany has moved forward." Perhaps most disturbing were those who continued their violent careers in post-war conflicts. Several former brigade members joined the French Foreign Legion, fighting in Indochina and Algeria. SS-Unterscharführer Konrad Schön, who had participated in the Warsaw Atrocities, died fighting Viet Minh forces near Dien Bien Phu in 1954 under the assumed name Claude Servin. Others found employment as mercenaries in various African civil wars, or as security consultants for authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and Latin America. The skills they had honed in brutality proved marketable in the shadowy world of post-war counterinsurgency operations. As one former member identified only as Schmidt told a German journalist in 1962, "What I learned with Dirlewanger served me well in Algeria." Some methods never change. Friedrich Schwend, a former Dirlewanger logistics officer, became notorious as a military advisor to right-wing regimes in Paraguay and Chile during the 1960s and 1970s, allegedly implementing interrogation techniques developed during anti-partisan operations in Belarus. When confronted by journalists in Asunción in 1979, he responded chillingly, "Counterinsurgency is counterinsurgency, whether against communists in Berlin or Santiago." The dissolution of the Dirlewanger Brigade thus represents not a clean excision of a cancerous formation from history, but rather the metastasis of its personnel and methods into the post-war world. While the unit itself ceased to exist in the war's final chaos, its legacy persisted in the unpunished crimes of its members and in the continuation of their brutal methodologies in new conflicts. The brigade's bloody end was not the conclusion of a dark chapter, but merely its transformation, a reminder that justice for the worst atrocities of the war remained incomplete, deferred, and in many cases, denied entirely. As Polish poet Tadeusz Różewicz, who fought against Dirlewanger's men during the Warsaw Uprising, wrote in his 1947 poem, Massacre of the Boys, "The killers simply changed their uniforms. While the blood on their hands dried, they walked free under new suns, their crimes buried with their victims." And with that, we close this grim chapter. Thank you for watching. If history teaches us anything, it's that we must never forget. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and never stop seeking the truth.